Hello and welcome. I'm Vishwanath Nair and you're watching NDTV Profit. This is the big story now. The recently concluded COP29 meeting at Baku, Azerbaijan has brought to fore a debate which has been bubbling for over 30 years. Now, Indian negotiator Chandni Raina highlighted that the two-week conference ended up just being a stage-managed event as resolutions were accepted without allowing developing nations to highlight their concerns. What Raina said was that the resolutions are merely an optical illusion. Now, developed nations have agreed to mobilize $300 billion annually by 2035 for financing climate action across the world. This falls woefully short of the $1.3 trillion requirement right now. India has rejected the provisions accepted during the conference, stating that the mobilization is too little and too distant to matter. Listen in as the Indian negotiator at the COP29 conference took the lead to express the disappointment of the Global South.
The goal is too little, too distant. It is 2035, it's too far gone. Our 2030 estimates tell us that we need to do it at 1.3 trillion per year till 2030. But we have only been agreeable to have, or we have a proposal that talks about 300 USD billion mobilization goal. It does not address the needs and priorities of developing countries. It is incompatible with the principle of CBDR and equity. Regardless of our battle with impacts of climate change, it is a fact that developing countries are accused continuously of emissions, forgetting the high per capita emissions of the developed countries, forgetting also the historical responsibilities of the developed countries. This only adds to the problem at hand for us, and the proposed goal shall not solve anything for us. In fact, we have to implement ambitious NDCs and economic challenges that we need to navigate and address the adaptation needs. The amount that is proposed to be mobilized is abysmally poor. It's a paltry sum. It is not something that will enable conducive climate action that is necessary for the survival of our country and for the growth of our people.
All right, so that was Chandni Raina talking about how the amount that has been agreed to mobilize has been paltry sum. Now, today on the big story, these are the three big questions that we are raising. The first one of which is that do developed nations owe a large debt to global climate action? The second question is that are developing nations being forced to pull more than their weight right now? And the third question that we're raising is there a need to rethink the entire structure of the UNFCCC under which the COP29 conference occurs? To discuss these questions further, we are joined by our guest today, Nishtha Singh, Assistant Director of Climate Asia Society Policy Institute, Hisham Mandal, from the Chief Advisor India to Environmental Defense Fund, and Pradeep Shah, co-founder of growtrees.com. Welcome all of the guests. I'll start with you, Nishtha. CBDR was something specifically that Raina ma'am had mentioned during her address. If you can just tell us a little bit about the agreement within CBDR. How exactly are these principles currently being violated?
Thank you for having me on the show. To give the basic background on what is the basis on which these climate talks happen every year. So basically, United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change is where multiple parties come together. These are divided into different parties. So we have developed countries who have historically emitted, and those emissions have made them rich. So they have the resources and they owe it to the developing countries to provide those resources to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Under UNFCCC, in 2009, developed countries had promised to mobilize $100 billion per year until 2020. And they were late in getting all the funds because that was fulfilled in 2022. In this COP, this was a climate finance COP, and India and other developing countries were asking for $1.3 trillion per year. And in that as well, so developing countries were asking for $600 billion as a core funding, which will come from public funds in form of grants or subsidized loans, and other funding can be mobilized through other loans like multilateral bank loans, etc., and that would reach to $1.3 trillion per year. But what has happened at COP is, we've seen it, it's just $300 billion, and that is also mobilized finance that puts more onus on developing countries to get these finances. And that is what makes everybody so upset. And that is why India registered its opposition so much to it. Along with that, what is also happening is countries, bigger jurisdictions like the EU, US, Japan, UK, they are planning measures like carbon border adjustment mechanism, which again puts pressure on developing countries to up their game, to invest in decarbonization technology, which is very expensive. And if, let's say, CBAM goes as it was planned, what will happen is that Indian industry will be paying to the EU. So when we talk about common but differentiated responsibilities, it's basically that historically, if developed countries have been responsible for climate change and its effect is being shown in the developing countries, there are least developed countries, island states that are at the forefront of the climate crisis. They need that funding, which the developed countries are refusing to give. So CBDR basically outlines that we all have common responsibilities toward climate change, but developed countries need to provide resources to the developing nations, which is not happening right now. So it's clear violation at different levels.
Right.
It's violation of CBDR.
Right, Nisha. Thank you so much for explaining that to our viewers. I'll move on to Hisham. Hisham, the viewpoint here seems to be that there's a responsibility, of course, for developed nations, which they are falling woefully short. In fact, by measures like CBAM, the onus is on developing nations, and they end up paying the developed nations for breaching certain requirements that they've been mandated. I just wanted to get a sense of this responsibility as a concept entirely. Inherently, that has been violated across the years.
Unfortunately, so first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for picking up this important topic. Climate change is caused not just by what we do today and tomorrow, but what we've been doing since the start of the industrial age, which is why Ms. Rana, the negotiator, spoke about per capita emissions and historical emissions. That is actually what has increased temperatures and gotten us to where we are right now. The idea that, if you're 70% of the problem, intuitively, you should be putting in 70% of the cost of the solution. That, I think, is where developing countries, emerging economies, the global south, when the Indian negotiator was speaking, she was speaking for India, but quite frankly, she was speaking for the majority world when she was making that point that it is not enough. There is no element of justice and equity in it, and it's not going to deliver results. So there is much reason to think that we have been violating it for a long time. The question is going to be what will change. The reality is that the political economy for such a large mass transfer of money just currently doesn't exist in the developed world, and it needs to be generated.
Right, Hisham. I'll move to Mr. Shah. Pradeep Shah, of course, co-founder of GrowTrees.com. Mr. Shah, the question here ends up being that your developing economies, which again form a majority of the world at this point in time, are ending up having to take a bill which is far more than what they're supposed to be participating in or taking on themselves. I just wanted to take a view from you, as a country beyond the objection that India has registered at COP29. What more can we do as India?
So we must rely on ourselves. Exactly what you're saying, Vishwanath.
Yeah.
The reason is that the economic power lies not with the developing countries, but with the developed countries. They are buyers of our products and services to the extent we export them. If we don't export them, we have problems. We cannot even import our oil, which is so necessary for daily living. So we have to depend on ourselves. And the fact is that we can do some things where, with the help of foreigners, such as, for instance, the transition to a green economy. That is, an economic opportunity for Indians, for domestic people, as well as for international people. So money of $300 billion can possibly come for that kind of thing. But it's where the resilient farming practices have to be developed, or preparing ourselves for floods, fires, typhoons, and the results of climate extremes. Or, for instance, helping people in times of disaster with better aid, or moving more the hardest hit people from the hardest hit locations to other places. That funding will not come. That was all part of that 1.3 trillion per year that developing countries are asking for. And so we will have to rely on ourselves for those kinds of things. And our budgetary provisions must give recognition to that demand or need for those funding. If we don't recognize it, if we don't set aside money for those kinds of things, we are going to be in crisis when sometime the climate crisis hits us through floods, fires, typhoons, or hardship of other sorts.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Shah, for articulating that. Now, before I move on to the next question for all of our panelists, I just wanted to show that the objection raised was not just limited to the negotiator from India, Chandni Raina, who's speaking. Other developing nations have also registered what they consider was a fairly unfair sort of acceptance of all these resolutions at COP29. Listen to the negotiator from Panama.
They throw checks at us at the last minute, shove it down our throat, and then for the sake of multilateralism, we always have to accept it and take it. Otherwise, the climate mechanisms will go into a horrible down spiral, and no one needs that. This is the only space that we have to negotiate and to work towards our common goals. We accepted the text because we could not leave Baku without a text, but we're not satisfied whatsoever.
All right, Nisha, I want to come to you. The Global South has registered its opposition. Apart from that, there are certain elements of this entire conference and this discussion which keep coming up, and that becomes the point of discussion that maybe we are missing the woods for the trees, for the forests. I want to get your view on this 1.5 degrees Celsius sort of target that was set back in Paris 2015, if I'm not wrong. I wanted to get your view as to what exactly is missing, because clearly in 2024, the expectation is that we're going to breach that 1.5 degrees Celsius target, and this is going to be the hottest year on record. Kindly take us through some of that and trying to make us understand, what probably is missing from this entire discussion.
So the key point here is that when we say 1.5 degrees target, we are actually talking about certain level of emissions in the atmosphere. As Hisham said before, that for over a century, the developed nations have been emitting, and that is the main reason behind climate change, what we are experiencing right now. So what happens is that I'll talk about the 300 billion or the 100 billion that we were talking about that the developed countries were supposed to give by 2020. What happens is that when we say mobilizing finance, it actually leads to, so for example, if Pakistan goes through a devastating flood, they get some loan from IMF, and that is given at a high interest rate. So that what that does is that puts that country under huge debt pressure. And And that's what is happening. When we say mobilizing finance, that it is mobilized mostly in form of loans through multilateral banks. And if you look at multilateral banks, even countries like India, Brazil, China, they have been contributing to multilateral banks as much as the developed countries are doing. So basically, there are many key issues in this discussion. One thing is that when climate change, extreme weather events hit developing countries, it poses huge debt risk as well on that country, and that also leads to locking of fossil fuels within that country for a longer period of time, because then we don't have transition finance. So all of these things become very important discussing point. And if we want to not breach 1.5 degree Celsius target, which we are very close to breaching, we need that amount of funds that the developing countries were asking, but were never given.
Right. Hisham, I want to take your view. This language of providing 300 billion versus mobilizing 300 billion. And Hisham, very expertly explained, mobilizing ends up being just a bunch of loans that the countries end up having to borrow. There is that inequity built into the entire system. So would that be a material change in the language of such conferences that is necessary so that the right message goes through and the right action follows?
Absolutely. Mobilize is a cute diplomatic term. I have a friend who's an investment banker. I'll connect him or her to you. And, if they give you a loan at whatever price, whatever rate of interest, that works. It's not a commitment from developed countries to provide funding. I'm sure there was loads of difficult negotiations on this wording, and there's a reason for that. The level of commitment when you promise to mobilize something is very different. Building on why this is important, the developing countries of the world are oftentimes the poorer countries, and they have significant economic challenges to begin with. High poverty rates, relatively low GDP per capitas, the need for significant investments in infrastructure, high levels of external debt already. Unless we're able to improve both the quantity and the quality of climate finance, we're never going to fix this problem. And the quality of climate finance is, first of all, it needs to be concessional. One of the challenges that loads of countries are facing on scaling up renewables is they're not getting concessional financing. So renewables promoters are going in and facing commercial market rates and trying to compete against other energy sources, which have a host of additional advantages on their side. The second is it has to be accessible. If you tie this whole thing down in bureaucratic red tape and it becomes difficult for countries to access that finance, then it's more theoretical than real. And the third, it has to be impactful. And the impact is both in terms of, does it make climate science sense? And does it finally resolve equity issues, especially with our most vulnerable communities?
Got that, Hisham. Mr. Shah, I want to ask you this question. Now, you said that India has to just pull up its socks and do it itself if the developed nations are not going to help achieve the necessary financing for climate action. But the world is a much larger place than this, and there's so many other countries who probably don't have the wherewithal or the kind of corporate presence that India has, which maybe makes it easier for accessing financing compared to maybe countries in Africa who probably don't have the capability to go out and borrow or raise that kind of financing that is necessary. In this environment, then, should we be looking at these developed nations, or can developing nations themselves internally start helping each other?
There is a provision, or there was a concept that the richer countries such as China, Saudi Arabia, South Korea would provide support for the developing countries to meet the target. So there's $30 to $50 billion, very small amounts to be provided by that. Now, some of that money will come by way of equity in not just loans, but equity or investment in green businesses, which are self-financing. They're economically attractive. And so money will come there and that will be counted as support from these countries. But what Nishtha first said, $600 billion or so, and I think Hisham also mentioned that substantial money, the quality of funding should be by way of grants from the West. If the West believes that equality of and justice require them to provide the support. But the rules-based order is going away under Trump. And therefore, we will have to fall back on ourselves, not rely on some United Nations rules and so on. As it is, the United States is not following World Trade Organization principles or any rule-based laws. They are deciding the rules on their own for their own interest. Make America great again, and it's for the United States. So India will have to stand on its own feet, and unfortunately, other countries that don't stand on their own feet or cannot stand on their own feet will suffer. There is no escape from that. So making themselves resilient by their own efforts is what is required now.
All right. Thank you for that. But I also want to let our viewers see what representatives from Samoa had to say during COP29. They were also part of the alliance group that actually registered their objection to the proposals that were accepted. Listen in.
Still not the deal that we wanted. We didn't come here to get the outcome, but in terms of the spirit of multilateralism, we wanted to engage with all the other countries, and it's come up with an outcome. Some of the, especially in the NCKG and the mitigation areas, that didn't go anywhere.
All right, so that was a voice coming in from Samoa talking about what exactly the proposals would mean going ahead. But I want to ask a quick question before we wrap up this discussion to all of our guests. Let me start with you, Nishtha, first. Trying to understand going ahead in the next conference discussions that will come up. What do you think is going to be the burning issue, or do you think that such a discussion is even warranted, considering the attitude that a lot of developed nations seem to be projecting here?
I think this COP has created some sort of a dent, as Chandni Raina also said in her speech, that for a multilateral institution to work, there should be trust within each of these parties. But what we saw this time, that the developing countries were not given time to raise their concerns or raise their objections before the NCQG bill was passed. So basically, I see that this does give some sort of a dent to this entire process. But again, COP is a very important conference that happens every year for climate. It is also the only place where multilateral discussions happen. So I hope it revives from here, and and we come back from here.
Okay, Nishtha. So apologies to the rest of our guests, Hisham as well as Pradeep, but that's the time that we have on the big story right now. Been an engaging discussion. I think this warrants a much longer chat. But thank you so much for joining us on this conversation, Nishtha Singh, Hisham Mandal, as well as Pradeep Shah, and taking us through some of your thoughts on the COP29 and the announcements that came in. That's it from the big story. Keep watching NDTV Profit.